Fab, and we're in.
Hello, Alexis. We got there.
Thanks for waiting, everybody. Yeah, we're here. It's Saturday afternoon. It feels very unusual.
Yes. Well, tomorrow afternoon, I wasn't going to be available anyway, because this time tomorrow, I will be running a seminar for a group of doctors on the topic we're talking about today, which is burnout.
Yes. Now, I'm sure that many people relate to this topic, especially given the changes in recent times, increased regulations, increased workload. It now seems, 2 years into the pandemic, that the body is now starting to say, wait on a minute, what just happened back there? And how am I going to maintain my energy going forward? A lot of people have changed their careers. Some have even, shifted roles quite significantly. So I think this is good timing. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, what I've seen in my practice is that people are still going through the normal, life stressors, whether it's sickness or divorce or family struggles or whatever. But then COVID and the pandemic has been background noise, background anxiety on top of all of that. And it's affected some people more than others, but it's affected all of us. And the reason I'm doing the seminar tomorrow with the doctors is because some health professionals have really been very affected. And my PhD was actually on the topic of professional and psychological burnout. So it just sort of occurred to me earlier this year that I wanted to return to my roots, so to speak, given this is an area that I have a lot of knowledge in, and I have myself been burnt out, and I've worked with a lot of professionals who've been burned out to a greater or lesser extent. And yes, COVID has exacerbated this experience for many people. Some people have loved the time during COVID, but many people have found life harder, of course.
So I think many people will relate to the term burnout. I mean, I quite like that it's such a descriptive word, because it does demonstrate the kind of loss of vitality, the loss of spark, the loss of enthusiasm, as the fire represents. And this is very much in line with naturopathic thinking, which is based around the vital force. And so, yeah, this is, as always, a big topic. But I thought what we could start with are some of the signs that you recognise in clinical practice. I can fill in some of the blanks there too. And then how do we deal with it so we can get quite practical? And it would seem a shame for us to only focus on the individual, given that many of the influences are systemic as well. So I'd love to put my public health hat on for that.
Okay, I'd love you to talk about that. Yeah, and when we look at a topic like burnout, which I'll define in a moment, we can look at, the very micro level of the individual, genetic risk factors, temperamental factors that predispose certain people to burn out more than others. Then we can look at the psychological and social factors in that person's individual life. And then, as you've said, we can look at some of the more systemic cultural. So it's an ecological model of human experience, which I always use, from micro through to meso through to macro. Now, what you were saying about our vital life force is, I loved hearing that, because I often say to people, well, if to have burnt out, you have to have burned. There has to have been passion there, vitality, motivation. You had to have been doing a lot and once very motivated or passionate in order to have burned out. Couch potatoes don't tend to burn out, if I could be so crass. So you've burned if you've burnt out. So let me give you a definition that I used in my PhD from Christina Maslach, which is also used in the ICD-10, the International Classification of Diseases, version 10, which is the diagnostic manual used in Europe and South Africa and other countries. In Australia and America, we use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, more so than the ICD. And burnout is not a disorder that's classified in the DSM, but it is in the ICD-10. So that's just an interesting factoid. And there's a bit of overlap between depression and burnout, but I'll come to that. Christina Maslach's model, which I used in my research, includes three factors. The first factor is emotional exhaustion. So emotional exhaustion is the fatigue that we accumulate over time from regulating our own emotions as well as somebody else's emotions. So hence we see carer burnout and helping professionals with high rates of burnout, and lawyers and police and other helping professionals who are often helping to regulate the emotions of the people they are working with who are in distress, while also regulating their own emotions. And over time, that self plus co-regulation can cause some fatigue if we, just have too much workload or we're not paying attention. The second factor of burnout is called depersonalization, and that's a kind of dissociation, feeling detached, feeling numb, going into autopilot, feeling sort of emotionally cut off. And this seems to be a coping mechanism when we feel overwhelmed. And in nurses and doctors and other helping professionals, we might see them treating their patients like objects, being a bit more callous towards them, and generally losing the love of their job. And the third factor is called diminished accomplishment, where, again, we've lost the love, we feel dissatisfied, we've lost our sense of purpose, we've lost our drive. And they're the three factors in the traditional model of burnout. And in more recent research, that they've uncovered that another core issue is loneliness. A lack of feeling like you're part of a team, or a lack of connection, or lack of support, leading to loneliness. Because I've worked with professionals who work very hard, work long hours, but when they collaborate in a team, working long hours doesn't cause burnout. It's working long hours, co-regulating your emotions with others while feeling quite lonely or isolated. It's a combination of factors. And the problem with chronic burnout, and I see a lot of health professionals who are chronically burnt out but still going to work, it leaves them more susceptible to mental health impacts such as anxiety and depression. It leaves them susceptible to physical impacts, so lowered resistance to illness, and behavioral impacts, so it affects their job performance, their efficiency, and in the workplace we see absenteeism. So there's my little academic spiel.
Yes. Okay. So I love a lot of what you mentioned, particularly the word accomplishment, because as we come to the end of the year, we've got almost 90 days left of the year, which is the perfect time, it's said by coaches, to set a goal and to actualize the goal. So it's a really great time for us to be aware of how do we harness our energies, how do we focus and apply ourselves so that we can make it through the end of the year and transition into the new year in a way that is facilitating who it is that we want to become. So I really resonate to the word accomplishment. I also, when you've spoken about that dissociation as a sense of coping, that again speaks to me of the need to conserve our energy. And, as there's been kind of increased expectations to be available on Zoom, to be totally engaged, receiving information, disseminating information, there is such a need for conserving energy. I don't know any better way than through meditation, apart from the fact that we're slowing the nervous system down. We're also quite instinctively or innately reflecting on what's important to us and our values, which I think is another core aspect when it comes to burnout. And your mention of collaboration, collaboration seems to be quite a common value, particularly given recent times where there has been a need for us to collaborate to achieve what it is that we need to achieve collectively. So, some really powerful statements there, even just in that definition of burnout. What is your primary, let's think of an example here. So there's a client who comes to you and says, look, I can maintain my baseline, but I would really love to up my ante towards the end of the year and achieve my big goals in coming year, 2023. What suggestions would you have for someone who was looking to increase their capacity while protecting their mental wellness?
I think you've nailed it. I think we do need to look after our poor little nervous systems. There's a lot to be said for the self-care of managing and looking after our nervous system through basic, the basic sort of mental hygiene factors of good sleep, good eating, getting some movement through whatever way works for you. Yoga's great. But walking or whatever, and meditation. So we've really got to care for our nervous systems. That's sort of the first crucial step, is the slowing down and the self-soothing. And, I've recently suggested to doctors that I work with that they take leave, that they've got to a point where they just can't keep going. I say extreme stress sometimes calls for extreme self-care. So, one of my clients has just gone on 6 months stress leave, and I think it's the best decision she could have made. Some of us don't need to be so radical. Some of us may just need to work 1 day a week less, or schedule in ways to have a dopamine reset, because the adrenaline and dopamine levels get so high in chronic stress and burnout, and they just fatigue us. It wears us out. And so we do need to find ways to reset. And as you've said, slowing down is not enough on its own for many personality types, because we have distress, but we have eustress, as the ancient philosophers called it. And eustress is good stress. We actually do need some stress in our lives, the stress of optimal challenge, the stress of learning and of, using our skills and our knowledge. This is optimum stress. And this is the stuff that gives us a sense of personal accomplishment. So it's not usually enough just to take time off work and become a couch potato or meditate all day. We do also need to do things that make us feel valued, like we're making a contribution, like we're of significance in the world. And pleasant activity scheduling, as the old school therapists used to call it. Remember the things that bring you joy or fulfillment, whether it's seeing friends, whether it's art, whether it's music or something else. We often, people who are burnt out have often lost touch with things in life that bring them joy or good stress. So I get my doctors at the end of the seminars to make a bucket list, to remember all the things they used to do and enjoy when they were younger, and all the things that they've always wanted to do but never tried. And I want them to keep that list handy so they can start scheduling in some of these things that will give them joy, give them accomplishment. As you say, have some goals to work towards. This is really, really necessary for human beings. So managing stress and building in joy, satisfaction. Yeah.
And again, I think that comes back to values. I know for myself, when I'm overly busy, I tend to feel like some things are incredibly important just because I'm kind of on the busy cycle. Whereas, if I can just even interrupt that intensity, sometimes it's enough for me to take a breath, get some perspective, remember what is important to me. And that does include relationships, and that does include, a beautiful environment, and that does include, as you said, self-care. So
for sure. And I wanted to just say one more thing. There's some inner work to be done for some people who are burning out or burnt out around their cognitive distortions and their maladaptive beliefs and their maladaptive coping mechanisms. It's very easy when we are fatigued to get into a negative mindset and start catastrophizing and being very pessimistic and a bit more punitive towards ourselves and others, and perfectionism can creep back in, and then we can, start becoming more judgmental, and then we start doing things like misusing substances and overeating, and then we feel like a victim. This stuff is chicken and egg. And so some of the work I do with people who are feeling pretty burnt out. Of course, there's all those behavioral interventions that we just spoke of, but there's also this cognitive level that people can work on in terms of how they're talking to themselves, practicing self-compassion, challenging their thoughts and beliefs. That's another element to treating burnout as well.
Yes, I'm sure you're right on that, Rachel. The micro moments that add up to the full day, that add up to the full week, and the way that we go about that.
Yeah, the micro moments, exactly. Hey, I've just seen a question here from Mia. She says, how long roughly does it take to recover from burnout? I know each person is different, but what is the average? It's a good question, Mia. And I think it depends on how burnt out the person is. Obviously, this is not binary. There's degrees of burnout. And if you look at the burnout questionnaire, you'll see that people get scores on each of those 3 dimensions. I've met people who are like this one doctor I was mentioning before, who's so burnt out. She's lost the love. She's having physical medical symptoms, dreading going to work, exhausted, not enjoying her job. She's taking 6 months off work. Now, unfortunately, it got to that point for her. And it didn't occur to her that she could ask for that and that she'd get it. But when she did, she got it. So that was to her credit. I think it's going to take her a few months to recalibrate and get her health back. But if you catch it earlier, like anything, you might just need a few weeks to reset your nervous system and get some new habits and routines in place.
We say in naturopathy as a rule of thumb that for the number of years you've experienced a condition, that many months to complete the cycle. Yeah, and I've certainly found, if the body is at the stage of burnout, that the immune system is under functioning, that can take, I'm thinking of a particular client, a psychologist, who has, diminished immune function, continued infection, and it took her a good 18 months of really deliberately working on self-compassion and mindfulness, retraining her pattern of thought. The unrelenting standards was a key for her. And she's really made a difference in her physiology. But that took a good 18 months for that to translate. So I think you're right. It can be quite a long journey.
And it takes as long as it takes. If you don't have your health and your mental health, it doesn't matter what else you've got, right? Because they're so foundational. Janet says, I frizzed my nervous system, and so now I have chronic fatigue syndrome. Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that, Janet. That is the unfortunate side effect for some people of chronic burnout. I hope that you are doing all the things you need to be doing now for your poor little nervous system.
Yes, and there is a lot. Speak to Rachel, speak to myself, book in and get that process started. The sooner the better.
Yeah.
And that reminds me too that there are some aspects of burnout that I believe are beyond the individual. So, when we talk about stress leave, of course, that's going to interrupt the cycle. But really, we're talking about the enculturated overwork, particularly in the professions where there is a tendency to perfectionism and unrelenting standards, as you mentioned, Rachel.
Yes.
So I think there does really need to be a commitment to changing that within your own personal sphere and surrounding yourself with people who will support that. Because if it's not supported by the profession, it could be a really long haul before we actually see that change. But we can, obviously the more we have these conversations like this, the more that you guys, the listeners, engage with us. There's a slow burn, and I fully believe that we can influence the systems, particularly in those long-standing institutions.
Yeah, well, teaching and the teaching profession and the legal profession have the highest attrition rates. Last I read, the highest attrition rates of any professional groups. So there's definitely a need for systemic change in the legal and teaching professions. In the ICD-10, they define burnout as chronic stress poorly managed. And the debate is, do we fix the worker or do we fix the workplace? And like many things in social science, the answer is both. You know, I've met people who are in quite supportive workplaces who still burned out, and people who are so bloody resilient that they could somehow keep functioning in fairly dysfunctional workplaces. So there's always an interplay between the environment and the individual. And yes, we do need to fix some workplaces and some systems. And, you know, each of us need to take responsibility for our own health, because, you know, that's the most empowering position or attitude to take. Did you want to say anything more about the broad level, or do you want to talk a bit more about that sort of what the individual can do?
I think I need to say that, you know, I think there's a real place for the Buddhist principle of Sangha, which is to find people who really do live the lifestyle that you want to live, and learn through osmosis. Because if, you know, if we're living in silos, I think it's very easy to buy into that competition, particularly with the, you know, with social media providing imagery that can perpetuate those kind of habits. So, you know, reaching out in more diverse spaces, I think would be a really helpful thing to facilitate systemic change, and finding people who really do value well-being as a way of life, I think is key for real lasting change.
Absolutely, because as I said at the start, one of the core issues in burnout is the sense of loneliness. And we know from the research, there's a couple of personality traits that make us more prone to burnout, and one of them is introversion. So if we're low on extroversion, in other words, we're more introverted, we're less likely perhaps to seek community, less likely to seek social and emotional support. And yet we know that social and emotional support, however and wherever you find safe connections, safe places, this is going to be a protective factor. Life is hard, burnout is a reality. So what we're looking for are protective factors, things that are going to buffer you from the stressors, things that are going to protect you. And social emotional support is probably up there as the number one protective factor. And I would say closely followed by having individual internal practices, such as gratitude practice, such as mindfulness, such as, you know, making reframing, cognitive restructuring. I can say a bit more about that, but to manage worry and rumination, you know, these kinds of individual practices are really, really important. And what I find amongst, you know, you're speaking about finding your Sangha, finding your people who support you. The unfortunate thing that can happen in workplaces and in other communities is that burnt out people hang out with other burnt out people, and there's this sort of malingering or social contagion effect where they kind of all talk about how burnt out they are, and they kind of complain and they reinforce the victim mentality in one another, and they all kind of sit around feeling sorry for themselves. I know I've done it myself. And there comes a point when venting, which is, you know, okay, and catharsis, which is okay, tips over into moan bonding. I've seen this amongst doctors and many other professionals, lawyers, carers, all sorts of people. Like, we're human, all of us. We can sit around and bond about our shared complaints. But I would say to anyone listening, be very careful of that, because at some point that's actually going to bring you down further. And we don't want sort of Pippi Longstockings or whatever who are just always positive and don't acknowledge the stressors of life. Pollyanna, I meant.
Yeah, I love Pippi Longstockings.
Sorry, I meant Pollyanna. You know, we don't want toxic positivity either, because that ignores the suffering and the stressors of our lives. So we want to find that middle path, you know, where we can acknowledge how difficult life is and all of the pressures, but we can be very mindful not to keep falling into the gutter of, you know, complaining and moan bonding. And like, I know people relate to this, because anytime I run a seminar on burnout and I mention moan bonding, half the room put their hand up and say, yep, I've done that. I know what that's like. And they say, you know, it's nice for a while,
Yeah.
but then it just makes me feel worse. So we do need individual practices, and we need to manage and curate our social support networks so that other people are also supporting our recovery.
That's right. Yeah. I've been hyper aware of this as being down in Melbourne last week with the family lawyers, and yeah, even using the terminology around burnout, I started to feel a bit burnt out. And it occurred to me that we can shift the focus to restoration and buoyancy, which, as you said, is a subtle reframe, but it does lift the mood to be talking about, constructively what we can do as individuals and what we can do collectively. And I just keep going to collaboration as a theme. Because there's only so much we can do as individuals, and particularly if you have a big vision, the only way to get there is actually through a genuine collaborative effort. So for many people who have that impetus to change the system, just that feeling of pushing uphill constantly can be very wearing. So the more we talk about burnout, the more I'm convinced that genuine connection and genuine partnering, the complement will all facilitate.
Well, that's because change, the work of being human, happens through relationships. Sarah has asked, when you feel burnt out and you know you need to change jobs, but you feel low and you feel unable to find a new job, how do you manage that? Well, I think there's a segue there. I understand that. And I think if you're not an extrovert like Alexis and I, it can be even harder to reach out. Like every time I've wanted a new job, I just tell everybody I know I want a new job. And somebody eventually goes, oh, hey, I heard about this new job. And that's, that's because I've always been quite a networker. But I think that, there's so many potential people out there who can help us. And so be courageous and just take a step, even though you feel burnt out, even though you feel a bit depressed and fatigued. Reach out to an employment agent. Reach out to anybody you think might be able to help you. This is the collaboration piece, right? Even if collaboration can be between two people, a recruitment agent and you, an old colleague and you. Reaching out for connections, asking for help. Like this doctor I was mentioning before, she was in such a deep, dark hole that it hadn't occurred to her that she could make requests. So we talked a lot about requests in one of our sessions. And by the end, she realized I can ask my boss for time off. It hadn't even occurred to her that that was acceptable. And then she did, and her boss said yes. Like, what do you know? But we can get in such a deep, dark hole that we forget that we can seek connection, make requests, speak our needs. And actually most people, if they can help us, they will. So I would encourage you, Sarah, to just take a small action to create connection with another or others who could help you out there. Andy says, I wanted to read Andy's question because it's such a good one. How do we deal with feeling guilty by lessening the amount on our plate? What do you think about that one, Alexis?
Avoid, so reducing guilt.
Yeah, so if you start saying no to things and reducing your workload, I really relate to this one. How do you deal with feeling guilty?
I love Brene Brown's very short video on boundaries. I'm sure I posted it before, but I'll post it again below because she talks about it being a loving act to say no, that it's a loving act to myself, but to somebody else as well. If I'm not giving my best, if I'm not giving great quality, it's a loving act to say no. That one certainly helped to relieve guilt for me. What are your thoughts on it, Rachel?
Yeah, I absolutely agree that saying no is an act of self-love, and that is what we must do when we start to burn out, or are suffering due to having having yes so much. And I think sometimes if guilt is our pattern, our schema, a habitual response, then we may have to just go through the guilt, live through it, but don't let it drive the vehicle, because the guilt will hijack you again and again into saying yes when deep down you want to say no. Guilt won't last forever. No feeling is final. So it may be a case of also, reframing it as an act of self-love, and whatever guilt is left over, tolerating the guilty feeling until it passes. Mindfulness.
And even as you've taught me so well, Rachel, looking at the need underlying that guilt, is it the need to be liked by somebody? Is there perhaps even some people-pleasing personality traits that could be uprooted for a more empowered approach, a more self-standing, a more autonomous way that may not please others, but is a stronger position to stand in.
I'd love to tell a very short story from my own life about this.
Yeah, please.
A few years ago, before COVID, when I was working really, really hard, and I mentioned to my husband that I was feeling guilty about not being able to do everything, he said to me very spontaneously, Rachel, you can't be all things to all people all the time. It was such an off-the-cuff remark, but the way he said it and the timing, I got tears in my eyes. It was really interesting. And I said to him with tears in my eyes, but I want to be.
You nearly are.
I want to be all things to all people all the time. And when the tears came, when the emotion around that came up, I was able to contact the need through the emotion, which is what we know happens. And I saw that my need brought to me by the emotion was for belonging and contribution and connection and competence, all beautiful, positive human needs. I just had unrealistic beliefs that I had to do all things for all people all the time in order to be significant, make a contribution, be competent, and meet those needs. But once I felt the emotion around it and realized I can't be all things to all people all the time, something in me lifted, and I guess a schema started to evaporate around that, the unrelenting standards one. And I saw that I didn't need to be all things in order to be competent, make a contribution, be significant and worthwhile as a human being. That's a story about an unrelenting standard schema right there, I think.
I like that so much, the evaporation of the schema. Yeah, of which guilt is an indicator that that we're reacting out of obligation or something other than our genuine values. If I may, that was a great question, by the way, about guilt, really well associated with the topic. But Sarah's comment, because Sarah is a very valued member of the community, and I just wanted to mention that something about the Big Five personality survey, which you've put me onto, Rachel, and I found that a very valuable self-reflection. So I can post that link also below, because certain qualities when the Big Five include openness to experiences, and I think that is something that certainly will help to secure a job or to find a job that you're looking for. But there would certainly be some healthy reflection on those Big Five, I think, that would facilitate anybody who's going through transition to look at themselves, to start to see where their strengths are and what areas could be bolstered.
And in lieu of going right into it, because it's such a big topic, even just this notion of is your personality prone to burnout, and can you change your personality? The answer is yes and yes. Some personality types are more prone to burnout, and you can change. Some personality traits are very amenable to change, particularly neuroticism, and particularly the article I'll post says that we can't change openness very much over the lifespan. Some people are just more open than others.
Oh, wow.
But we can, there's more malleableness in neuroticism. So if you're a person who's prone to depression, anxiety, worry, anger, or feeling excessively vulnerable, which some people just are naturally, then you can actually change some of that. You can actually become less anxious, less self-conscious, less depressed through doing your inner work. And 16 weeks of therapy is what showed up in this research study can really change that aspect of personality.
Weeks.
Yeah, well, in the article I'll post, they said it can be as quick as 16 weeks of therapy if you're really working on the depression, anxiety, vulnerability, and self-consciousness and anger stuff, which can really hold us back from, being brave and making changes. And the other one we can change is if we're not naturally extroverted and more introverted, we can still work on our confidence, on our courage, on our social skills. So they were the two that were most impactful on burnout, but fortunately they're the two, neuroticism and extroversion, they're also the two that are most easily changed, which we're most able to.
Interesting. Yeah, that's such a positive note. And that might be a good place for us to end, knowing that, we can do our work, influence our neuroticism, our extroversion, and treat some of those symptoms that we started with around withdrawal and loneliness and the diminished accomplishment.
Yes, exactly.
Was there anything you would like to sign off on, Rachel?
Maybe you could just remind everyone quickly about our practice group and our retreat.
Yeah, well, retreat is sold out last I looked, so I'm not even sure we've got any places left. Those of you who've spoken to me, you are absolutely on the books. But the practice group is going to be the last Sunday of this month, which will be the 30th of October. And that is that's our monthly group where we get together and we share nonviolent communication and we have a cup of tea, and it's deeply nourishing. So that would be a good place to address any of these symptoms.
Yes.
So that's all I have from my end.
Me too. But if you know any doctors who are burnt out, put them on to me, because I'm continuing to run some seminars for doctors over the coming weeks. So get in touch with me. I know you've got a family dinner to run to, Alexis. So thank you for your time today.
My pleasure. And yes, I just wanted to mention the GP burnout retreats will be happening next year. So definitely get in touch with Rachel about that. I do happen to have a couple of places left for anyone who's interested in a 90-day goal accomplishment before the end of the year. So please reach out to me on that one.
Wonderful. Okay, well, I'll share some links in the comments below and we'll see everyone sometime. We'll let you know next weekend. Okay, sounds great. Thank you, Rachel. Enjoy your evening. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everyone. Bye.